A stone sits across the mouth of a cave on a hillside 2 miles from Jerusalem. It has been there 4 days, inside, wrapped in linen, soaked in spices that cannot quite cover what they are meant to cover. Lies a man named Lazarus. You can still smell the olive oil from this morning's cooking, drifting out of the houses nearby ordinary smells, refusing to pause, just because grief has taken over the street. Outside the cave, women are wailing the kind of wailing you hire professional mourners to lead, the kind that fills a Middle Eastern village for days after a death, and walking toward that sound, dust still on his sandals, is a man who could have stopped this 4 days ago, and didn't. He stops, he looks at the stone, and then, in front of everyone his closest friends, a crowd of strangers, men who are already plotting to kill him, he starts to cry. 2 words, that's it. The shortest verse in your Bible. Jesus wept. You've probably heard that verse quoted as a joke, the one Sunday school kids memorize because it's short. But here's what almost no one tells you. This is not the only time he cried. There are at least 3 recorded moments in the New Testament when God himself, wrapped in human skin, broke down in tears, and there's a 4th one so loud, so violent, that the men standing closest to him couldn't even stay awake to witness it. No gospel writer saw it happen. We only know about it because of a single sentence buried in a letter written years later. We'll get to that one. Not yet, but keep that question in the back of your mind as we go. If the men who walked beside him for 3 years didn't catch every tear he cried, how many of your own tears do you think the people around you have missed too? This is not a story about a miracle. This is not a story about a man walking out of a grave. This is not even a story about grief. This is a story about every single time the God of the universe could not hold back the water in his eyes, and what each kind of tear was actually for. Let's go back 2 days before Lazarus died. A messenger reaches Jesus with 3 words from his sisters. Lord, he whom you love is sick. That's all Mary and Martha send, they don't beg. They don't demand. They just tell him the truth, and trust that love will do the rest. And Jesus, knowing exactly what's coming, stays where he is. For 2 more days, you read that right. The man who could heal a leper with a sentence let his friend die. On purpose, he tells his disciples plainly, this sickness will not end in death. And then Lazarus dies anyway. Stay with me, because this is where the story stops making sense the way you expect it to. When Jesus finally tells his disciples it's time to go back to Judea, they panic. Rabbi, they say, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you. And are you going there again? They remember what almost happened the last time he showed his face in that region. But Thomas, the one history remembers for doubting, not for courage, says something you don't expect from him. Let us also go that we may die with him. Thomas thinks this trip is a death sentence. He goes anyway, by the time Jesus finally arrives in Bethany. Lazarus has been in the grave 4 days. In that culture, 4 days mattered. There was a belief that a person's spirit lingered near the body for 3 days, hoping to return and left for good on the 4th. Everyone in that village knows what 4 days means. It means hope is officially gone. Martha reaches him first. She's the practical one, the one who manages a household, the one who once scolded Jesus for letting her sister sit and listen instead of helping in the kitchen. And now she runs to him with words that are part faith, part accusation. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Jesus tells her, your brother will rise again, and Martha, still grieving, still confused, gives the answer of someone who has memorized her theology, but hasn't yet felt its weight. I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. That's when Jesus says in one of the most staggering sentences in the entire Bible, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. Not someday, not at the last day. Right now, standing in front of her, is the resurrection itself. Then Mary comes. Mary, the sister who once poured a year's wages worth of perfume on his feet and dried them with her hair. She doesn't walk to him like Martha did. She falls, right at his feet in front of the whole crowd, and says exact same sentence her sister said. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Same words, completely different posture. Martha approached him standing. Mary collapses, and something happens in Jesus that the Greek language describes with a word far stronger than English translations usually let on. The text says he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. The Greek there is closer to a horse snorting before a charge agitation, even anger, a kind of holy fury rising in his chest. This wasn't quiet sadness. Something in him was disturbed at the sight of death itself, at what it had done to people he loved. He asks where they buried him. "Lord, come and see," they tell him, and then walking the last few steps toward that tomb, surrounded by people who don't yet know what he's about to do, Jesus wept. The Greek word used here is dakrio. It means tears falling silently, not wailing, not crying out, just water on a face, quiet and uncontrolled, the most human moment in the entire Gospel of John. Well, here's what most people miss. He is about to raise this man from the dead. He knows it. He told his disciples it would happen before they even left for Bethany. Well, he is seconds away from shouting into a tomb and watching a dead man walk out wrapped in burial cloths, and he still cries. The miracle does not cancel the grief. Well, the resurrection, coming in 4 minutes, does not make the funeral happening right now hurt any less. You can know how the story ends and still feel the weight of where you're standing in the middle of it. Well, maybe you've lived some version of that tension. You know God is good. You know the ending of your story is still being written by someone who loves you, and none of that knowledge makes the funeral happening today hurt any less right now. Well, Jesus doesn't rush past that tension to get to the miracle. He stands inside it fully before he does anything else. The Jewish mourners standing nearby notice it too. Some of them say, "We'll see how he loved him." Others, already suspicious of this man who healed a blind man not long ago, ask a sharper question. Could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind have kept this man from dying? Well, Jesus doesn't answer them. He walks to the stone. He tells them to remove it. Martha, practical to the very end, warns him about the smell. 4 days is 4 days. And then he prays out loud. Well, not for himself, but so the crowd will understand what's about to happen is from God. And he calls into that cave with a voice loud enough to wake the dead, literally. "Lazarus, come out," and he does. A man bound head to foot in grave clothes walks out of a tomb that had sealed him in for 4 days. Jesus tells them to unbind him and let him go. This is the first time you see Jesus weep in the Bible. Personal, private, over one friend, one family, one grave on one afternoon outside one small village. It will not be the last. You might assume this is where the chapter on his tears closes. One grave, one miracle, one happy ending. It isn't. That was the smallest of his tears. One friend, one family, one tomb. The next time you'll see him weep, he's not crying over one grave. He's crying over an entire city, a city that, in just 40 years, will be burned to the ground, exactly the way he's about to describe it. If a video like this is new to you, this channel breaks down moments like this every week, the parts of the Bible most teachers skip past too fast. Hit subscribe before we keep going, because what happens next is the part almost nobody talks about. 5 days before he dies, Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey while a crowd throws palm branches at his feet and shouts Hosanna, a word that literally means save now. They think they're crowning a king who's about to overthrow Rome. They have no idea what kind of saving he actually came to do. The road is covered in cloaks and palm branches. Children are climbing trees just to see over the crowd. It's the kind of noise a city makes only once or twice in a generation. And then, in the middle of that celebration, with people still cheering around him, Jesus stops. He looks out over the city, the temple gleaming on the hill, the walls, the rooftops. Centuries of history stacked stone on stone, and he weeps. But it gets stranger. This is not the same kind of crying you saw at Lazarus's tomb. The Greek word here is kleio, and it doesn't mean quiet tears running down a face. Well, it means audible weeping, wailing. The kind of crying you can hear from across a room. In the middle of a parade celebrating him, Jesus is sobbing loud enough for people to notice. And he tells them why. If you had known, even you, especially in this your day, the things that make for peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. Then he describes in specific, brutal detail, what's coming. Enemies will build a wall around the city. They will hem it in on every side. They will tear it down, stone by stone, and not leave one stone standing on another because, well, he says, the people did not recognize the time of their visitation. This is not a story about a king entering a city. This is not a story about a parade. This is not a story about palm branches and shouting crowds. This is a story about a God who wept over the very people who would help nail him to a cross 5 days later. Here's the part nobody tells you. This prophecy didn't stay a prophecy. 40 years after Jesus said those words, Roman armies under General Titus surrounded Jerusalem. The Jewish historian Josephus, who lived through the siege and wrote about it in detail, describes a city under starvation so severe that families fought each other over scraps of food. That the temple itself was set on fire against the orders of the Roman commander, and that the walls were dismantled so completely that visitors afterward could barely believe a city had ever stood there at all. Josephus called it the worst catastrophe his people had ever endured. Jesus saw all of that 40 years before it happened, and instead of feeling vindicated about being right, instead of saying, "I told you so" to a generation that would reject him, he cried, "Pay attention to this, because it tells you something about what kind of God you're dealing with." He wasn't crying because he was helpless to stop it. He wasn't crying because he didn't know what was coming. He was crying because he loved a city that was about to choose its own destruction. And love doesn't stop loving you just because it knows what you're about to do. You've probably felt some version of this, watching someone you love walk toward a decision you know will hurt them. Knowing you can't stop them, knowing the only thing left to do is grieve in advance for the version of them you're about to lose. That's the weight Jesus is carrying as he looks at Jerusalem. This isn't quiet, private grief like Lazarus's tomb. This is grief with volume, public grief. Grief in front of a parade of people cheering his name, who in 5 days will be cheering for someone else to die in his place. 2 kinds of tears so far, 2 completely different words in the original language. 2 completely different scales of loss, 1 friend, 1 city. If you've ever sat in a packed room, celebrating something, a wedding, a homecoming, a promotion while quietly carrying a piece of information no one else in that room has yet, you know exactly what that tension feels like. Jesus is at his own parade, and he's the only one who already knows how the story ends. There's a small church on the Mount of Olives today, built in the shape of a teardrop, marking the traditional spot where this happened. Visitors still stand at that exact viewpoint, looking out at the same skyline, trying to imagine what made a king cry on his own parade day. There's one more set of tears coming, and these ones are the loudest of all 3. So loud, in fact, that you won't find them written down by anyone who was actually standing there. It's the night before he dies. Jesus walks with 11 of his remaining disciples. Judas has already slipped away into the dark to finalize a betrayal into a garden called Gethsemane at the base of the Mount of Olives. The name itself means olive press, a place where olives were crushed under stone weight until oil ran out of them. He could not have picked a more fitting place to spend his final hours of freedom. Olive press. Think about what that name actually means. Olives don't release anything valuable until they are crushed completely, until the full weight of the stone comes down and there's nowhere left to escape it. That's the place Jesus picked to spend the worst night of his life, not by accident. He takes 3 men deeper into the garden with him, Peter, James, and John, the same 3 who once watched him transform into blinding light on a mountaintop. He tells them plainly, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me." And then he goes a little further, falls on his face on the ground, and prays. And this is where it gets remarkable. None of the 4 Gospels actually use the word wept for what happens next. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all describe him praying in agony. Luke even adds the detail that his sweat fell like drops of blood hitting the ground. But not one of them writes the words "Jesus wept" here, the way John did at Lazarus's tomb. So how do you know there were tears at all? There's a letter in the New Testament written years later to Hebrew Christians by an author whose name we don't even know for certain. And buried in it is a sentence that changes everything. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications, with loud crying and tears, to him who was able to save him from death. Loud crying and tears. The Greek phrase there uses the word krauge, a scream, a cry torn out of someone, not a polished prayer recited calmly. This was not Jesus kneeling peacefully under an olive tree. Well, this was a man on the ground, screaming into the dirt, tears soaking into soil that would, within hours, watch him get arrested 20 yards away. And here's why no gospel writer recorded it the way they recorded the other two. Well, they weren't watching. 3 different times Jesus came back to check on Peter, James, and John, and 3 different times he found them asleep, the men closest to him. Well, the ones he asked to simply stay awake and keep him company in the worst hour of his life couldn't manage to do even that. The only reason you know about these tears at all is because someone, decades later, writing to a different audience entirely, happened to mention it in a single sentence, almost as an afterthought. The loudest tears Jesus ever cried were witnessed by no one who loved him. They were heard only by God. You know what that feels like, even if you've never said it out loud. The nights you cried hardest weren't the ones with someone holding your hand. They were the ones alone, in a car, in a parking lot, in a bathroom with the water running so no one would hear, in a hospital hallway at 3 in the morning while everyone else slept. The deepest pain you've ever carried, you probably carried it the way Jesus carried his, mostly alone, mostly unwitnessed, mostly in the dark. Think about a parent sitting outside a hospital room door at 2 in the morning. The only sound coming through that door is the one they can't fix, can't stop, can't take for themselves no matter how much they want to. All they can do is stay, not solve it. Just stay close enough to hear it. You may have been on either side of that door, the one waiting, helpless, outside, or the one inside, in pain too deep for anyone else to actually carry for you. Even the people who love you most. Both of those are lonely in completely different ways. Jesus, in this garden, somehow ends up being both at once the one in pain and the only one fully awake to witness it. That's where Jesus is in this garden. Except this time, he's the one inside the door, and the people who were supposed to stay close enough to hear him are asleep 20 feet away. And still, after the loudest tears of his life, after sweat like blood, after 3 failed attempts to get his closest friends to simply stay awake, he stands up. He wakes Peter, James, and John, and he says, "Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. He doesn't run. The torches are already visible through the trees. Judas is already close enough to be heard." And Jesus walks toward all of it anyway, eyes still wet, voice still raw from screaming into the ground minutes earlier. 3 times, 3 different Greek words, 3 completely different kinds of pain. Quiet tears for one friend in a small village, loud public weeping for an entire city that didn't know what it was about to do to itself, and screaming, desperate, unwitnessed tears in a garden the night before a cross. Here's what that actually means for you. First, grief was never beneath him. The God who spoke galaxies into existence also could not stop himself from crying at a friend's grave. If tears are good enough for him, they're good enough for you, and you don't owe anyone an apology for crying in front of people who are quietly judging the timing of it. Second, he doesn't just understand your pain from a distance. He has felt the quiet kind, alone with one loss. He has felt the public kind, grieving in front of a crowd that didn't understand why. And he has felt the kind so loud and so lonely that no one even wrote it down until years later. Whatever shape your pain takes, he's already cried that shape of tear. And third, the one that should actually stop you for a second. Every single time he wept, he kept walking forward anyway. Toward the tomb he was about to open, toward the city that would reject him, toward the cross waiting at the end of that garden path. The tears never stopped him from finishing what he came to do. And that means your tears right now, whatever they're about, don't disqualify you from finishing what you're walking toward either. Maybe you've never told anyone about a tear you cried in silence. Maybe today's the day you finally do, even if it's just in a comment under this video. So here's the question. Out of these 3, the quiet grief at a grave, the public weeping over a city, or the screaming, unwitnessed tears in that garden, which one hits closest to something you've actually lived through? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone.